That's such a half-witted bunch of people, my God.
Here's a guy who was never elected to anything, and he had more power than anyone who was, more power than any mayor, more power than any governor, more power than any mayor and governor combined. And he held this power for 44 years, and with it, he shaped all New York City.
Is the provocation of a man who challenges you to like him. He does stuff for people. He's also done terrible stuff to people.
We don't pay too much attention to the critics. We never build anything. No critic ever built anything.
Imagine a time before the megacities, a New York where nature thrived. This was the dream that bound together Franklin D. Roosevelt, the young, charismatic politician, and Robert Moses, the ambitious builder. Both envisioned a state adorned with sprawling parks and havens for all to escape the urban sprawl. Over the years, Robert Moses had reshaped New York's landscape with an iron fist, building parkways, bridges, Jones Beach, and parks at a breakneck pace.
It's like Picasso in front of a canvas. He sees this whole area with whatever number of people as one picture.
Robert Moses, whose very enemies would say that he, more than any other person, is the man who built New York. To the east, the United Nations building, perched astride one of those incredible Moses peripheral highways, then the Whitestone Bridge, and the Throg's Neck.
But his ambition had a price, and a powerful adversary was about to emerge from the shadows. He was known as the Feather Duster. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the great figures of the 20th century, who would later go on to be known as FDR. It's worth pointing out at this point in history, this is not the four-time elected president FDR rallying America through the Depression and fighting World War II. At this point, Franklin Roosevelt is an aristocratic state politician with a very famous last name. His distant cousin was president, and that gets him a lot in the political world at the early 20th century. Roosevelt is a state Democratic politician who had supported current Governor Al Smith by delivering his 1924 nominating speech at the Democratic Convention, which was the first time that Franklin Roosevelt made a public appearance after contracting polio and being essentially paralyzed from the waist down. He had, however, never fit in socially with the governor's inner circle and was called the Feather Duster at school due to his propensity to fly in and out of interests. Governor Al Smith was quoted as saying,
"Franklin isn't the kind of man you can take into the piss room and talk intimately with."
None of them ever guessed that Roosevelt was using his position to make a future presidential bid of his own. When Al Smith appointed Robert Moses onto the Long Island State Park Commission, he also appointed Roosevelt to the Taconic Parks Commission. At this time, Roosevelt had an assistant named Louis Howe, who he required due to his disability through polio, and he could not afford to pay Howe a salary and tried to employ him as a secretary. Moses disliked Howe and tried to prevent the move. This was one of the early elements of the rivalry.
That was one reason he didn't like me. It's perfectly simple. The governor had to give him some kind of a job, and it was difficult to find one, so he made him a secretary of the Taconic Park Commission, the region where the governor lived. He was the chairman of this commission. And this fellow told me, he was a very arrogant little bastard, and he told me he wasn't going to do any work. He wasn't there. He was instructed by the governor to take this job. I dropped in once a week, see how things were going. Well, we had some very major problems and plans for the Taconic region, in which Roosevelt was very much interested in. And he was a very good head of that commission because he knew everybody up in that area there. But Louis Howe never got over this thing. And I said to you, if you're going to work or you're going to get out. And he went to the governor, and that started the trouble. And I said, all right, get somebody else. I'm not going to have a nominal head man of this commission. It's going to tell me that he's working for you and that he had I have no business asking him what he's doing. And that was the basic trouble.
Another was Roosevelt's interest in parks, one as strong as Moses's own. Conflicts arose between the two over Moses's rejection of Roosevelt's budget requests for the development of the Taconic parks and parkways. Roosevelt complained to Governor Smith, threatening to resign, and as Smith required his support for his own presidential bid, he made great efforts to smooth things over, supporting Roosevelt to ultimately succeed him as governor. Moses ultimately disagreed with this, but political expediency ensured that Roosevelt got the nomination. Moses called him a pretty poor excuse for a man. Roosevelt's dislike for Moses was just as intense. Al Smith lost the presidential race to Herbert Hoover, but Roosevelt won the governorship of New York in 1928. Al Smith retired and prepared to assist Roosevelt into the governorship and help him carry on the previous policies. But Roosevelt was evasive. He was against leaving Robert Moses in power, and he was already planning for the presidential race in 1932.
The appearance before a national convention of its nominee for president to be formally notified of his selection is unprecedented and unusual. But these are unprecedented and unusual times.
However, Robert Moses was difficult to remove. He had built a power structure in New York all his own, supported by public opinion, and in the end, Roosevelt had to live with Moses, if not as Secretary of State, then as chairman of the Parks Commission. Fast forward to 1934, Franklin Roosevelt, now as the 32nd President of the United States, felt that it was time to get his revenge on Moses. Franklin Roosevelt had said of Moses,
I don't trust him, I don't like him.
As governor, Roosevelt had been forced to ration himself to occasional sips of revenge on the man who had frustrated his dreams for a Taconic Parkway, humiliated him, and viciously ridiculed not only himself, but his wife Eleanor. But now Roosevelt was president, and he evidently felt it was time to indulge himself. And the president's move against Moses began by withholding money from New York City. And the mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, now knew about the feud and history between Moses and Roosevelt.
When you took the job with the city, with Fiorello LaGuardia as the Parks Commissioner, you also held on to your state job as well, didn't you?
Oh, yes, well, I had that previously.
Well, it's quite unusual for a single man to hold powerful positions in both the city and state governments, and many people have said that that was the key to your getting things done, was wearing these many hats.
Roosevelt said LaGuardia would not get vital funding if Moses remained in power on the board of the Public Works Administration-backed Triborough Bridge Authority. LaGuardia had a difficult decision with much at stake, a vital project in the Triborough Bridge for New York City, which could only be built if the federal government was willing to pay for it. LaGuardia now tried to get Moses to resign from the Triborough post. However, it turns out that this was not an easy task, and Moses could not be removed unless he was charged with a misdemeanor. On November 7th, Moses sent to Washington new Triborough requisitions totaling $8.1 million, roughly $188.2 million today. The requisitions reached the desk of Harold Ickes, Secretary of the Interior and Administrator of the Public Works Administration. Ickes then telephoned LaGuardia the next day and told him that they would stay on his desk, unsigned, until Moses' resignation lay there beside them. He also stated that no new PWA projects would be approved for New York City. All throughout the subsequent months, the drama of revenge and power played on. Its cast included some of the most colorful characters in American politics. On one side, jaw-jaunty, cigarette holder, face open and friendly, the master politician in the White House. And on the other side, a modern Horatius on another unfinished bridge. Then, on December 26, 1934, Roosevelt and Ickes threw on those delicate scales something that weighted them to the president's side and raised an official General Public Works Administration order, Order 129, that stipulated that no funds would be given to any authority whose head held public office. This obviously referred to Moses, who held the board position on Triborough Authority, as well as New York City's Parks Commissioner, and gave LaGuardia a public excuse to fire Moses. Roosevelt also told LaGuardia that funds would be resumed if Moses would simply not be appointed the following year. When he received a copy of the order, it had not been released publicly. He showed it to Moses to prove to him that he had no choice but to give in. But LaGuardia had miscalculated, as had Roosevelt and Ickes. They may have believed that Order Number 129 had left Moses weaponless, but they were wrong, for Moses still possessed a weapon more valuable even than his popularity amongst the public: his mind.
Robert Moses was a political genius.
He conceived a masterstroke that turned the tables on his greatest enemy. In a daring move, upon being cornered by a powerful opponent, Moses did the one thing that no one involved in the closed-curtain drama had expected. He leaked the order to the press, and thereby pulled the curtain up, showing Roosevelt to be involved in New York affairs. The battle lines were drawn, and the future of New York would be decided not just with shovels and steel, but with political maneuvering and backroom deals. Moses was showing himself as an underdog, fighting for the city against the federal powers that be. The press firmly lined up on Moses' side. LaGuardia now came under intense pressure as Moses had turned the situation around. Roosevelt, however, would not give an inch. He still wanted to go through with the order. Unfortunately for him, the press found out that Roosevelt was aware of and even directed the order. The reformers then joined on Moses' side. They made it a matter of the principle of the division of powers, of the city being held hostage by the president. And by mid-February 1935, the level of protest became countrywide and unignorable. A congressional investigation was talked of. A report from the Attorney General judged the order to be illegal. Roosevelt was desperate to find a way out. LaGuardia suggested that he would apply the order in the future, but not retroactively. Former Governor Al Smith had been persuaded by his supporters to intervene, and he decided that now was the opportune time. He called a press conference supporting Moses, but not directly attacking Roosevelt, but rather attacking his administrators. As a result, Roosevelt decided that this was the time to back down. Ickes signed an unconditional surrender to Order Number 129 that should not apply with reference to Mr. Moses of the Triborough Bridge Authority. Robert Moses had won the battle and retained public confidence. With funding resumed, the Triborough Bridge project was finally completed. It was an engineering marvel. It wasn't just one bridge, but a complex network connecting 3 boroughs of Manhattan, Queens, and the Bronx, with 3 separate decks and over 8 miles of roadway. It was on an immense scale. The bridge used an unprecedented amount of materials, over 1.2 million cubic yards of concrete and 80,000 tons of steel were needed to construct this behemoth. For comparison, that's enough steel to build 15 Eiffel Towers. And with the labor force required, the Triborough Bridge project employed thousands of workers during the Great Depression, providing a much-needed economic boost. It was a massive undertaking in both scale and manpower.
Bridges grow in immensity, and in New York, of course, they take their bridge building seriously and mix it up with the latest recipe in traffic ramifications. 7 years it took to build and cost $64 million. When you've translated that into pounds, you'll no doubt be impressed. If San Francisco's bridge is longer, New York's has more brackets and angles, and it's so big that the cars down below look literally like ants.
The ceremony opening for the Triborough Bridge, held on July 11, 1936, was to add a tinkling little grace note on inspiration of pure wit to the resounding triumph Moses had won 18 months before in forcing Roosevelt and Ickes to complete the project. When the invitations were mailed, one went to the White House. no reply was immediately forthcoming, and the reasons were certainly understandable. The president had been forced to eat one large slice of humble pie on the Triborough Bridge issue. He was understandably reluctant to be forced to choke down another helping on the bridge's center stage. Ickes attempted to encourage Roosevelt, but Roosevelt's response was a memo, only 2 paragraphs long, but quite revealing.
I wish much that I could go to the Triborough Bridge opening on July 11th. It is impossible for me to come down from Hyde Park that day. Incidentally, it would be an all-day trip to New York and back. I really think that if you and LaGuardia take hold of the ceremony, you will so greatly outshine Brother Moses that we will be able to sing, "Where was Moses when the lights went out?"
Press speculation over whether the president would attend was mounting. Other presidential advisors joined Ickes in pointing out that the bridge was the largest PWA project in the East, that it was in the president's own home state, and that its location in the country's media capital would ensure its dedication nationwide publicity, and that credit for it should go to the president's administration, and that the president's absence would arouse press misinterpretation that he was afraid to confront Moses again. At the last minute, Mayor LaGuardia was able to announce that the president was coming after all. It was extremely hot on the day of the dedication, 97 degrees on the temporary speaker's platform on the bridge's center span. And that may have been the reason why 3 of the speakers, Roosevelt, Ickes, and LaGuardia, were sweating. But reporters noticed that Moses was strikingly cool in his white suit. He was a gracious host when the president's party arrived, letting his charm wash over Ickes, and introduced all the speakers except the president over a nationwide radio hookup. Both Roosevelt and Moses avoided voicing their mutual animosity, effectively putting their public dispute to rest. There was, of course, one somewhat unusual note in Moses's introduction of Ickes, but no reporter thought to analyze the letter and see its application to Roosevelt and Ickes. Ickes even wrote in his diary that he was quite pleased by the introduction. If Ickes had attended Yale, Moses's alma mater, and had taken Chauncey Brewster Tinker's course on Johnson and his inner circle, his pleasure might have been somewhat diluted. Professor Tinker had delighted in telling his students the story behind the scholar's letter. Setting out on the task of compiling his great dictionary, the scholar appealed for the financial assistance he desperately needed to Lord Chesterfield, who had encouraged him to expect it, but had then rudely rebuffed him. When, however, after 7 years of privation and hardship, the work was completed and acclaimed, Chesterfield had attempted to represent himself as Dr. Johnson's patron and take some of the credit for it. It was then that Dr. Johnson wrote to him,
"Is not a patron, my lord, one who looks with unconcern on a man struggling for life in the water, and when he has reached ground, encumbers him with help? I hope it is no very cynical asperity to be unwilling that the public should consider me as owing that to a patron, which Providence has enabled me to do for myself."